Hey, have you ever had questions about how to use a 1031 exchange, either as a real estate agent advising your clients or as someone who's wanting to sell some property and possibly use this 1031 exchange? I'm Pat Porter. I'm the broker for RecLand Realty. Here we talk about the rural real estate business and ideas and information to help you better manage and enjoy your own property. If you've ever had questions about a 1031, I want to talk to you for just a minute about the bare basics, just a few of the really big parts of the 1031 to help you decide if it's something you want to do, or if you're a real estate agent, maybe you've got a client that's considering it. Keep in mind the 1031 exchange, tax deferred exchange, is a complicated process. There's very detailed requirements and stipulations in the tax code for it. This is a big, broad, baby step look at it. And basically, three things I want you to keep in mind. The last few weeks, I've gotten a few questions about a 1031 exchange from people that watch our videos simply because I just happened to mention it in passing on a video a few weeks ago. And suddenly I got several questions about it, and it caused me to realize, hey, people don't really understand some of the just basics of it, or they've misunderstood some things. So here's some things I want you to understand. Number one, a 1031 exchange, if you're selling property, can't just be done last minute. Now, yeah, there's always exceptions. People can pull something together. Attorneys can pull something together right at the last second. But if you're going to utilize the 1031, you need to do that in advance. What I mean by that is if you're selling a piece of property, you need to communicate with your real estate agent, especially at the time of contract when you have a buyer. Hey, I'm going to use a 1031, or I may use a 1031 exchange, and that just needs to be put in the contract. It just needs to be understood by the buyer and the closing attorney or title company that there's going to be a 1031 exchange involved, and there's going to be some extra steps involved in that. You can't just wait 3 days before closing and go, hey, I want to do a 1031 and expect the title company or attorney just to pull that off. No, it's not that way. You got to arrange that in advance, and there are a lot of reasons why. You can get into that later by talking to your tax attorney or by talking to a title company. They can explain that a little more, but just know you need to know in advance you're going to do a 1031 before you get to the closing. Encourage you to make sure it's put in your contract in selling your property. Second thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to actually trade properties to use a 1031. A lot of people think that, hey, if I'm going to use a 1031 exchange, they have to really be trading properties with someone, and they've got to go find that property, find that seller, and say, hey, I want to trade my property for your property, and do that. Well, you can do that with a 1031 exchange. In fact, we've got a large deal going right now with one of our guys where they're actually exchanging properties. And I've done that with clients in the past too, where there were two physical properties that were literally being exchanged under the 1031 exchange, and that's doable. You can also use a 1031 exchange where you're selling your property. The proceeds of that sale will then be used to go and buy another property that you might not have even identified yet. And that word identify is important because that's part of the language in the code of the 1031. When you sell a property, you get proceeds from that sale. Actually, you don't get them. It goes to an intermediary, but that's a little more involved. Talk to your tax attorney about that. The money from the sale of your property is set aside for you to then use to buy a property that you've identified. And you've got 45 days from the date of your sale to identify another property that you want to buy. You can actually identify several properties, but you got to have them identified by contract within 45 days of the date of sale. And then you've got up to 6 months to close that sale or sales and use your money to buy that property or those properties. So you can exchange properties in a 1031, or you can have the proceeds of the sale set aside for a period of time and then identify properties you want to buy with that money. So that's an important distinction to make. You have some time to use your proceeds from a 1031 to identify and buy another property. You don't have to do it all at the same time. So keep that in mind. Hey, the third thing about a 1031, and it's almost like number 2.1, it's related to the previous point, is that when you sell your property that you're using or that you're going to use in a 1031 exchange, you never take possession of those funds. That money goes to an intermediary. If you ever take possession of it, it's a taxable event, and then you'll have capital gains for the sale of your property. But that money, when you sell it, doesn't go to you. It goes to an intermediary. It's held there. You never take possession of it. So you don't have use of those funds to do just whatever you want to with. That money is set aside, that money then is used to buy another property. So I wanted to make that distinction really clear. If you ever take possession of the money, if the funds ever come to you, it's a taxable event. You can't do a 1031. That's why I said in part one that it's not something you can just throw together last second at the closing table or 2 days before or after you've gotten the check and go, hey, I want to use this now as a 1031 and buy another property. Too late. You've already taken possession of the proceeds. It's a taxable event. You now are responsible for any capital gains. And that's all fine. That may be good to do it that way. Hey, another point I want to make to you is you can do a reverse 1031. You can actually buy a property that you want to use for your 1031 before you sell your current property. It's called a reverse 1031. I've been involved in one of those before. You may have a property on the market that is about to close, or you've got a contract on, and you got another property you absolutely want and you don't want it to get away. You can go ahead and buy this property under the 1031 exchange and then use the funds from the sale of your property, which will happen after, to close that sale or to close the loop on the 1031. It's when you buy before you sell. Again, talk to an intermediary, talk to your tax attorney to get the details on that, to make sure that you have the timing right, to see if it's something you want to do. Last point I want to make, and it comes from a specific question that I just recently got. I remember it clearly. He said, Pat, how do I know how much money I can use in the 1031? Well, I think he was making the question too complicated, and I messaged him back and gave him the answers. The way you know how much money you have to use in a 1031 is the sale of the property that you're selling. I mean, you're going to have a real good idea of your proceeds from the property you have for sale to know how much money you then have to 1031 in to another property, to roll that into another purchase. If you've got a property you're selling and it's under contract and it's, you got a contract for $450,000, you've got a ballpark idea of the net proceeds of that, or you can get that ballpark idea from the closing attorney or your real estate agent. You then now have an idea of how much money will be set aside with the intermediary that you can use in a 1031 exchange. So keep these points in mind. If you want to use a 1031, talk to your tax attorney, talk to your CPA to decide whether or not a 1031 is even worth doing. You've got time restraints and you've got some costs that are associated with a 1031 that aren't going to be part of a regular sale. And by the time your accountant, your CPA tells you what your tax burden would be without the 1031, you may go, it's just not worth the trouble. It's not worth the cost. And so there are times you're going to want to use a 1031, and there are other times it just isn't worth it. It's just not saving you enough money to go through the trouble. So anyway, thanks for watching our videos. There's some more right there. Check them out.